And good morning, everyone. My name is Daniel Rogers, and I'll be standing in for Don Preston throughout this entire week for Morning Musings. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope that you'll enjoy our short time together. And I hope that you'll also keep Brother and Sister Preston in your prayers while they travel this week to learn more about their current situation, as well as learn the proper course of treatment for Sister Preston as she undergoes this difficult time in her life. I thank you for being here this morning and tuning in to this episode of Morning Musings. I'll be with you this entire week from Monday to Thursday. I'll try to get the videos up at 8 a.m., but today was kind of difficult trying to figure out how to do all of this. I'm not used to making presentations like this, so I hope you'll bear with me, and hopefully we'll be able to grow closer to God together. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Daniel chapter 12 and the resurrection of the just and the unjust. If you're not in the loop, just this past week, Dr. Don Preston and Dr. David Hester of the Eastern Meadows Church of Christ engaged in public debate. Now this Thursday, I plan on doing a review of that debate for this morning musings. I want to go back and listen to the speeches one more time before I do that, just to make sure I have all my ducks in the row, and I want to be able to say everything that I think would appropriately represent that debate. And so I will be doing that review this Thursday. But the resurrection of the just and the unjust is something that Dr. David Hester and Dr. Don Preston were debating about this past week. And Daniel chapter 12 went virtually untouched by Dr. David Hester. Sure, he made a few passing comments about it, but he did no work at all to prove that Daniel chapter 12 was not dealing with the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. That was one of Don's main points, and in fact, it's one of the only 3 or 4 passages in the entire Bible that specifically mention the resurrection of the just and the unjust. So it would seem odd that in doing a debate on the resurrection of the just and the unjust, that passage would go hardly noticed. But I believe there's a reason why, and you're going to see that reason as we move on through today's morning musing. Now, I have a slideshow available for this morning musing, and I will be posting that to my website, and you can find that in the description below. And if you somehow can't locate that, it'll be at www.labornotinvain.com. Now, Daniel chapter 12 is the basis for the New Testament teaching on the resurrection of the just and the unjust. This is undeniable. When you begin to read the New Testament writings, you'll begin to see reference after reference to Daniel chapter 12, whether it be Jesus in the Olivet Discourse, or whether it be Paul in Acts chapter 24, or even in John chapter 11. I believe Martha was referencing there Daniel chapter 12 and verse 13. Over and over again, you'll find this passage mentioned. In fact, the book of Daniel is highly quoted throughout the New Testament, and it is the basis for the earnest expectation of the kingdom that you can read about in the first few chapters of Luke. And it's an extremely important book in dealing with eschatology. But Daniel chapter 12, as I've said, is the basis for that resurrection hope. In fact, the New Testament writers made it plain over and over and over again that their eschatological, or their time of the end hope, their last things hope, what they viewed as the end, that hope was based upon Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. In 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul said, "Then comes the end." That's the resurrection. It's going to take place at the end from the viewpoint of the Apostle Paul. But that wasn't the only time in that book that he mentioned the end. He mentioned the end in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 6, 7, and 8, dealing with the miraculous gifts. He mentioned it in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and said, "The end of the ages, the goal of all of the ages has come upon us." He mentioned it again in 1 Corinthians 13. And he said, "When that which is perfect is come, that which is in part would be done away," looking towards the teleos, the end, the goal of all the ages. And he got his teaching of the end directly from Daniel chapter 12. because in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4, we learn that the resurrection would take place at a period known as the time of the end. And so as you can see, Daniel chapter 12 is very important. The Apostle Paul even said in Acts chapter 24 and verses 14 and 15, "But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets. I have hope in God, which they themselves also allow, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both the just and the unjust." This teaching is based out of Moses and the prophets. Well, when you survey the Old Testament, the passage that talks about the resurrection of the just and the unjust is Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2. It's the only passage in the Old Testament that explicitly mentions the resurrection of the just and the unjust at the time of the end. Look it up and do a word study, and you'll see that that's the case. This is also the basis for the resurrection teaching of Jesus in John 5:28 and 29, when Jesus said, "Marvel not at this, for the hour is coming, into which all that are in the graves shall hear his voice and come forth." By the way, the reference to the graves comes from Ezekiel 37. More on that maybe in a couple days, it depends. He says, "They that hath done good to the resurrection of life, they that hath done evil to the resurrection of damnation." Again, it is the resurrection of the just and the unjust. You see how simple this is? But the question becomes, what is Daniel chapter 12 talking about? Well, Daniel chapter 12 is talking about the time period known as the last days. In Daniel chapter 10 and verse 14, Daniel's told specifically that he was about to learn things that would take place in the last days of his people. Not the last days of the end of time, not the last days of the unending, everlasting Christian age, but the last days of his people. The last days of his heavens and earth, Isaiah 65 and 66. And so when we think about Daniel chapter 10 to 12, it has to fall within the time period known as the last days. Now guess what? That means that regardless of what your opinion is of the transition in Daniel 11 and 12, from Greece to Rome or from Greece to nobody at all, it has to fit within the designated time period known as the last days. You go back and you read Daniel chapter 2, and we see that the last days includes Rome. All right? It includes the fourth empire, the empire of iron. Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar, "I have come to make you know what's going to come to pass in the last days." So whatever concept of Daniel chapter 10 and 11 and 12 that you have that doesn't fit within that time period of the last days of which Peter stood up and said, "This is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel" in Acts chapter 2, then your concept of Daniel chapter 10 and 11 and 12 is wrong. But guess what? Jesus, in a divine commentary on Daniel chapter 12, made it plain that the last days, that the resurrection of the just and the unjust would take place no later than the generation in which he was living. Jesus stood up and said in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 34, or maybe he sat down and said, as it was tradition for them to do, he told them that everything that he had discussed would come to pass within that generation. That includes the time of the end of Daniel 12 and verse 4. That includes the great tribulation of Matthew chapter 24 and 21 and Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1. That includes the resurrection of the just and the unjust of Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2, and as is discussed in Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following. That's going to include the coming of the Lord in power and great glory on the clouds of heaven, as Jesus mentioned in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 30. That will include the sending of the angels, verse 31 of Matthew 24. That's going to include the sounding of the trumpet of Matthew chapter 24 and verse 31 as well. It's going to include stars falling from heaven, the sun being turned to darkness, and the moon into blood, as he discusses in Matthew 24 and verse 29. And all of that is based upon and is a commentary on what Daniel talks about in Daniel chapter 12. So you can see that this text is undoubtedly important. And when we return tomorrow, when you come back tomorrow, we'll talk more about Daniel chapter 12 in anticipation of my review of Dr. Don Preston and Dr. David Hester's debate upcoming this Thursday. You don't want to miss it, so be sure to tune in tomorrow for morning musings. I have a few announcements to make before we close. Let me skip to the end of the slideshow here. Again, please remember to keep Brother and Sister Preston in your prayers as they travel to learn more about the cancer treatment options. Also, don't forget that Preterist Pilgrim Weekend will be this July 13th to 15th, in just a few weeks, on the problems with postmillennialism. I'll be speaking at that lecture, and many other good men will be speaking at that lecture as well. The annual lectureships at the Ludington Church of Christ in Michigan will also be in a few weeks, on August 4th through the 6th. And at that lectureship, there's going to be a public formal debate between Steve Basin and Drew Leonard. Both good men, both capable Bible students, and so we'll be looking forward to that debate upcoming this August. Also, be sure to go to my website, www.labornotinvain.com, for articles, audios, and other resources that will assist you in your studies. Dr. Don Preston always suggests a book to you towards the end of his morning musing, and I'm going to suggest a couple to you in this musing, and I will give you some more as the week progresses. If you go to Amazon.com and you do a search for the name Dallas Burdett, you will find an excellent selection of books, including a commentary on the book of Revelation, a commentary on the book of Daniel, and some other interesting books. One on the evidences of Christianity, for example, that was said by one dean of a university in Alabama that it was a very, very good book, and he was going to try to get it to be suggested reading because of the clear, common sense way that Dr. Burdett goes to establish the truth of Christianity and the validity of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Well, anyways, thank you for tuning in with me today, and I hope to see you tomorrow morning, a little bit early, but at the same place, right here on Don's YouTube channel. Have a great day, and God bless.